It's no secret to you that we confess Christ together when we gather each week. After all, on any particular Sunday at 7 Mile Road, we confess sin, we confess the gospel to be true, and we do this as we sit under gospel-centered preaching. We confess the gospel to be true as we take communion together, and we confess the gospel to be true as we sing songs responding to God's grace later on. Taking all of this together, you are not likely surprised to hear that we confess together of Christ as we worship. You just aren't going to be surprised with that. What's interesting about this verse, though, is not that we aren't supposed to waver in confessing Christ. You would get that. Like, we would expect that. What's interesting of this verse is the reasoning that the author of Hebrews gives us for why we will be confessing Christ. And what he says is that our not wavering in our confession of Christ is not a result of us. Instead, Hebrews tells us that we hold fast the confession of our hope to the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who has promised is faithful. Because he who promised is faithful. So the reason that we're holding fast to the confession of Christ, which we do together, isn't about any of us being strong. It's about the body of Christ hoping in not ourselves or our collective wisdom or strength, but hoping in the one who is faithful. See, when we gather for worship, we are confessing our hope in God by trusting that Christ has made this new and living way for us to enter into the presence of God. And then by drawing near to God. And all of this centers around holding fast to Christ's sacrificial work on our behalf. Our confidence before God revolves around the objective work that Jesus did on the cross and its sufficiency now and on the day of his return. Our confession is that God is faithful and that what he has said of Christ is true. See, we're hoping and confessing that the promise of Christ as our perfect sacrifice is true. That the promise of Christ as our great high priest is true. And at the end, we're hoping that it's all true. We're confessing that it's true. Not because we've seen it with our own eyes, but because God is faithful and he keeps his promises. See, we confess because of God's faithfulness. As one commentator puts it, our hope is based on the unfailing promise of God. Why should we not cherish it confidently and confess it boldly? Why should we not? And to our end today, to see how this confession of Christ is advancing the mission, I want to tell you two ways that this confession of Christ each week results in mission. First, corporately, this confession is missional because it is missional for a confessing church to be present in a community and a town. See, it's the responsibility of the local church to bring the good news to a community, to the community surrounding it. So it is God's blessing to a city and to a people for there to be gospel-confessing churches in it. Our cities don't know that, but they will one day. Right now, we seem to be a nuisance sometimes. But one day, all the people of this world will see what an immense blessing it is that local churches, we're part of a community, we're in a community, and we're blessing a community by proclaiming the good news. Individually, the confession of Christ is missional because it's a blessing to a city to have people living in it, living in that city, that rise on Sunday mornings, eager to gather with God's people for Lord's Day worship. See, it's a blessing for a city to have people living in it that gather with God's people each week to draw near to God, to confess Christ, and to stir up one another to love and good works. Essentially, to stir up one another to love that very city that they live in. So I want you to know that it is missional when you forego work, hobbies, and activities on Sunday mornings because you're called to worship your Creator. Your actions are a testimony to the work of God in your life, and others are blessed whether they know it or not. So thank you for loving your cities this way.